Hey, I'm Josh Dillon. So, first of all, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to watch this episode. Before we jump into the next podcast, I just want to take a quick moment to explain to you why we started the Creatre cast. 4 years ago, I founded a company with the goal of connecting Africa to the digital economy and the world to Africa. Over time, we realized that this challenge was a lot greater than what we had expected. In order for us to achieve this vision, it required something extremely important: community. It takes a village. That's why we started the Creatre cast, to create a space where we can interview and profile the members of our community and share how they are connecting themselves to the economy and others too. So that's how the Creatre cast became a thing. We made this podcast with the hope of illuminating what is possible for our people and inspiring you to join the African wave yourself. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what this vision is, but I'm going to tell you at the end of the podcast, and I'm going to let you know how you can get involved too. Until then, let's hop onto the wave. Let's start this journey of elevating Africa. It's a pleasure having you here. Let's get into it. So Jerusha is very much a significant player in the field of data innovation. I know that Jerusha, you're very much into creativity and you really have a dedication to empowering young Africans. And anyone who's a part of the Creator community, you can kind of see why Jerusha is a part of this discussion, because she's been doing amazing things in the data creative space. And she's also runs a monitoring and evaluation company called Data Innovators, or Data Innovators, which she's going to tell us a little bit more about. Do we say data or data? I don't know. How do we say that in South Africa?
I don't think it matters really. Yeah, it's more American to say data or data. So we should say data, but it rolls off the tongue better when you say data innovators.
Data. Okay, we'll stick with data then. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I think the first thing I wanted to ask you, Jerusha, I wanted to get a little bit of a sense in terms of your background, right? And just kind of find out a little bit more about your life and career journey as an individual. So a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are interested in tech and they're interested in the creative space. And I think what's really cool about what you've done is you've kind of merged those two things together. I know that you are a very creative person, but you're also very much in touch with technology and how we can use it to build the economy. So I wanted to find out from you, how did your journey start? Because you founded Data Innovators, so you've got a very entrepreneurial background. How did that journey start, and where did your interest in data come from?
Sure. Well, firstly, thanks for having me on the podcast. Yeah, my journey started quite a while back, so I'm going to keep it somewhat brief because, in fact, from an academic side, I started in quite a data-heavy space. So that was really my entrance or my introduction to data. My degree or my undergrad studies was in biochemistry, biotechnology, and then I specialized in pharmacology and then public health and epidemiology. So I dealt with like a lot of data in that work. But really, the reason I had entered that space is because I think even from a young age, uh, I was passionate and interested about solving problems, but also thinking about like how am I addressing a social issue? How can I contribute my kind of knowledge in a space where I'm solving problems for others, for the public, for our country, for Africa? And so that was some of my drivers. But I think in parallel, I've always been a creative. So like, as a kid, I loved the arts. And I think many people have gone through the stages where for those that have like kind of this multi-potentialite approach where you might be good at engineering, but you also love painting. And I was one of those where I'm like, I love the technical, I love science, I love data, but I also love, you know, how art is used to convey stories. And so as a kid, I spent a lot of time painting. My father kind of introduced me to art. And I always had that at the back of my mind. And I think it was like always incorporated in my work that even when we were doing experiments or writing reports, it's like, oh, how could I make this look differently? And so my academic kind of career started in that space, mainly in public health. And I worked with various NGOs in South Africa And a little bit late in my career, I then expanded in kind of a regional project where I then worked in different African countries and got to travel to Angola, got to travel to Zimbabwe and many other places, which is amazing. And what stood out for me in that work, so in my role during that time, I was mainly working as a monitoring and evaluation professional, which is really somebody that helps funded organizations figure out what how you use the data. I mean, how you use the funding rather. Like if you invested in HIV prevention, what change did you actually create? What is the impact you're making? And so I spent a lot of time helping setting up these measurement systems and also help build the capacity. But what stood out for me during that time is that often we are like, so the technical people can be too technical. The people that are doing the good work are they're getting their hands dirty. They don't necessarily have time to look at what is the model saying, or it's not their core competence. And so this is kind of again where like my creative interest bridged, where I'm like, actually, how could we use visual approaches to create this bridge between information and the usage of it, because it is valuable. Like ultimately, development organizations really do need to think about actually, what am I doing right? What can we shift? Are we reaching the right people? Because that's when you really hit kind of that impact point. And so I started introducing and just playing with things, like looking at how do I teach myself different infographic tools, and start packaging content in different ways. And that really was kind of the beginning or the path of the journey of like, actually, I entered in a development space. I used data a lot, but then I kept on asking, actually, like, how could I do this better? How can I make it useful for those? Um, Rather than just be a technical person that's like developing amazing models and analyses and statistics, and it ends up being shelved. And yeah, there was also then a bit of, it was kind of a point in time where I think I was ready for the next, but also the timing, like the end of my previous role, all kind of came together. So it was like all of these things were building up, and a little bit of kismet happened. And so then I started Data Innovator. So I'm actually in the second iteration of the company. The first iteration was Data Innovator without an S. It was, we kind of joke about it here and said that's Data Innovator 1.0. It was singular and then it became plural. And so in 2015 is when I started Data Innovator, or the 1.0, which is really a bit of like the motivation was around still wanting to solve this problem of like, how do I make information more accessible? How do I bridge my technical and creative side? And how do we make this bigger? Because I started seeing value in it. And that really was the start of it back in 2015. And it's since kind of grown from there. But I'll pause there because I think I've said a lot.
No, thank you for the insights. And you mentioned quite a few things. I actually want to ask you a little bit more about your experience working in different African countries, because I think what happens a lot of the time is, I mean, I actually went to Angola last year on a connection flight to go to Portugal. And I decided when I was going to fly there, I really wanted to see more of Africa. So instead of just doing a connection that was maybe like a 1 or 2 hour layover, I decided to do a full day layover so that I could kind of see what the city was like and get a little bit more of experience of what the rest of the continent is about and what you can find there, right? And that's what I did. And it was a little bit of a shock for me. Really realized that, we live in South Africa, and South Africa is a little bit different to the rest of Africa from what I've seen from my experience in Angola. And I don't think a lot of people know that in South Africa specifically. And I also know just from being a part of conversations with the continents, or with other people on the continents, and also working with other people. So the nice thing about what we do in JD Creations is we all our offices, or our team is all mobile, so we can work with anyone from anywhere. So, for example, earlier this year we were working with someone who was based in Uganda, and that was a very interesting experience, because working with them, you kind of get a sense of their perspective and the environment that they're coming from. So you learn a lot from that. But not everyone has that opportunity. And I think there might be people in South Africa listening to this that don't have that experience. But then conversely, I also know that being a part of those conversations with people that are coming from different countries across Africa, a lot of them have a sentiment that in South Africa we kind of breathe flavored air, and we think kind of like that South Africa represents the rest of Africa. So I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about like your experience in Africa. What were kind of the standout things there? What did you learn? What good things came out of that experience, and what do you think other African countries are doing right that we could maybe learn here in South Africa?
That's a big question. I mean, there's many kind of responses to that, and I must say, well, firstly, I think often when I won't generalize South Africans, but many people, when we say Africa, we see it as like one country, which is really annoying. It's like
Yeah.
Africa is, and I think that's one big thing that I have a very clear view of. Like Africa is so diverse. Like every country has a unique context, and within that country, there are many other contexts. Because I mean, even in South Africa, KZN has very different kind of even a landscape and people and cultural norms compared to perhaps Northern Cape. Uh,
Mm,
and if you kind of realize that, you realize how diverse really, like if you spread that across, like what is it, like 50 plus countries in Africa, it's a very, very different and diverse context. And I think sometimes, from my experience in development, people struggle with that we apply like something that's worked here or worked elsewhere, we assume it will work elsewhere, or we don't understand why it's not working elsewhere. Like, why is it a challenge to like in some countries the mobile payment is streamlined, it's very normal. Like I think it's M-Pesa in Kenya, like that is a very common form of payment for many people, whereas in South Africa not so much. For certain groups of people it is. And I think it's really because like there are these little nuances that it is only when you engage people from those countries, or you have visited the country, or you've actually engaged with the content about the country, do you understand those differences. And I think in my work, that's been quite important, because when you're dealing with information and trying to solve problems with that, you really need context is so important. Um, and I think it's just that appreciation of understanding that there is so many different contexts across the continent. But like you said, there's also a lot to learn from each other, and I think we don't often do as much of that. This kind of cross-country sharing. There's a lot of like in Nigeria, the tech ecosystem, in Ghana, in Kenya, it is like it's just going crazy. It's booming there, and I think there's a lot we can borrow from that. I think things like, I know in Nigeria, this kind of the small business policies and things are really set up to help small businesses thrive, which it's quite like certain things make it challenging, even things like tax, or
mm,
having BE requirements and so on, actually changes how we operate as small businesses in South Africa. um, and there are policies in other areas, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana, that actually are more supportive of small businesses and kind of less restrictive. It makes it also easier to access kind of investment. So I think those are the things that I've picked up, is kind of those investment and policy kind of ecosystems that are more enabling for small businesses, particularly tech, to thrive. Um, and I think there are other lessons to be learned across, like not just us learning from others, but shared across. I recently did a project where we did a scan of different kind of technologies, organizations that have been started in Africa, and just looked across like what are the differences in context and what's informing whether these kind of tech companies can or cannot thrive. And it was really interesting because I think things like policy environment definitely came up, but then there are other nuances. Like in Ethiopia, one thing I didn't know is that currently there's only one telecoms provider, which has a major impact on everything. Because if, for example, in South Africa, if we were only dependent on Vodacom and Vodacom is not able to operate consistently, it businesses would
it's
would
sort of
not succeed. Yeah,
Yeah, it's sort of like ESCOM. Like we have to rely on ESCOM for electricity. It's a similar thing, but for signal now.
exactly. Exactly. So it's like you realize, we've learned certain lessons. How are those being shared in other countries, or what are the what are the nuances there that we are not learning from each other to create more enabling environments for small businesses, for development? Because I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot that we don't necessarily learn from each other. But again, like I said, like ultimately, my main lesson was around context. And in fact, just a quick story on that. When I started out, because this is an important lesson I learned very early, and it's something I'm quite passionate about. Is like I love immersing myself in an experience and knowing, how is Josh different to everyone compared to Jerusha, compared like there are uniquenesses about us. And when I was studying, I was doing my master's in public health. One of the things I invested in myself was, it was also a little bit naughty, is that I took a lot of I had received some funding for my studies, and I hoarded and I worked hard, and I saved a lot. And just before I finished, because what I felt when I was doing my degree was that I was learning a lot of things from textbooks and not able to like really comprehend, like, what do you mean that cultural norms are preventing people from using condoms? Like what does that mean? I don't
Yeah.
understand. And I used that kind of hoarding of my funds, and I was like, I want to go see it. And I was fairly young at that time. And I spent all of that money, emptied my bank account, and I traveled. I was like, I'm going to go to two countries mentioned in my textbook. I want to go to the hospital they're talking about. I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't go to the exact hospital, but so I spent like 2 months in Ghana, and then I flew and I spent about a month in Brazil, and I went into the favelas. I wanted to kind of really smell and know, what is life like? Why is it different here? Why would an intervention look different in Brazil compared to Ghana? And I mean, I learned a lot, because there's certain kind of in certain villages in Ghana, it's very conservative. So obviously, like, your communication around HIV prevention and so on would be very different to what you would share in Rio.
Mm.
So yeah, those kind of experiences are valuable for young people and others to actually, obviously not everyone can go fly to Ghana, but
Yeah.
before you question context, like, really understand what it means and how does that apply in your work, and yeah, the future of the continent, really.
Yeah, there's that saying like the devil is in the details, right? I think in this instance, you could also say the angel is in the details as well, right? And like you were mentioning how when you look at individuals, when you start diving deeper and you start going and immersing yourself into these different spaces, you don't just come across the bad things, you also come across the good things as well. But what's important is being able to immerse yourselves and also be open to understanding something is different, and also being aware of the fact that not everything that you have here represents what there is around the globe. There's so many different
Exactly.
ways of doing things, different ways of thinking, and we can all learn from one another. And like you mentioned, not everyone has the opportunity to go and travel there, which is why I asked you that question, because a lot of people that might listen to this might not have the funds to go and travel, but we can learn from one another, from each other's experiences, and that's what opens up our minds. So thank you for sharing that. I really admire that. Like, I didn't know that you actually went and traveled there to go see what was happening in your textbooks, because that's the one thing about university, right? Is you kind of very separated from the stuff that you're learning. And then once you get into the work environment, you're kind of thrown in the middle of it. And then you actually start
Mm.
understanding the things that you've learned from the experience that you're gaining. So that experience element is so important. Just coming back to the discussion of details, I think that's also why data is so important, because you can capture so much detail in data. I wanted to ask you another question about data, right? Was there ever a point when you realized the power of data, when you were like, flip, this is like really powerful stuff? Was there ever a situation that kind of like flips the switch in your mind where you're like, okay, no, data is something that I need to get into?
Mm. Let me think. I don't know if there was necessarily like a switch point, um, because I think it's like it, it has always been okay. Maybe there was somewhat of like a transition point, and I think it was that kind of period where I was working with people. I was using data. Like, my job was gather data, tell us if it's working or not, or track these indicators. And then when I share that with people and I say, okay, you hit 50% of your target, it doesn't really mean anything to them. And I think that those are kind of the points where I was like, okay, so what is this about? Like, what's the point of
Mm.
sharing you've hit 50% of the target and it means nothing? And I think the point of then interrogating those things and then repackaging it and saying, okay, it's not actually just about the target, but if you look at where you've been working, you look with the need, and if you look at the need, actually we've been spending time in the wrong place maybe, or we should be doing more of this. And then really that the response then to that kind of guidance where people are like, oh, you're right, oh, we should shift. I think those were some of the trigger points where I was like, this is valuable because now it actually, data is translating into an action that is actually going to shift or drive something positive for somebody's life, as opposed to you hit 50% of your target and we carry on doing things that may never work. And I think that's kind of some of the points I'm like, actually, this is important, not just data in itself, but how data is being used. Because I think that's the gap. We have lots of data all over the show. It's the usage of it and the packaging that's important.
But it's also the real life implications of it. And it comes back to that discussion of like how the textbook is so separated from reality. And a lot of the time, the textbook is representing reality, but experiencing it is completely different to reading it in a book, right? Which is what we discussed earlier. The same thing applies for data, right? Data is numbers, it's measurements, it's quantitative. Those numbers represent something that's happening in real life, but it's very easy to get disconnected from the real life implications. So, like for example, if someone comes to you and says we raised an extra 50% in profits, like, oh, okay, cool, we've got 50% on the number's good, awesome. But now if you go to someone and you say, you know what, I'm going to raise your salary by 50%, that's going to have a completely different impact on them. Even though the implications are kind of the same. I mean, we raised 50% in profit, so therefore you could get paid more. But that increase in salary, that's something that actually affects my life. Now I can actually go and buy this or do that or whatever it is. I can put that money to good use. Those are two different experiences, right? And I think that's kind of where I'm seeing data innovators comes into play. It takes the numbers and it kind of shifts it into reality through storytelling. Like when it comes to that concept of storytelling, what kind of like implications have you seen, or like how have you seen that elements of storytelling and data? How have you seen that play out into real life implications and translate into reality? And what kind of have you seen come out of that whole process of putting a story behind the data?
Yeah, I think often the putting the story behind the data is a really good conversation starter and it really drives people to start acting. I think often we are working like the clients we work with are maybe they are funders or so they're the ones that might invest in something. Um, and when you're looking at information as purely like a simple set of numbers, it's really hard to then decide on the next. And it's also hard to like identify the emotive value because it's quite complex when there are so many things that one could spend on or invest in to really hone in on actually like where's the development challenge. And people connect both to the numbers and that kind of the personal aspect. And so we've used that in like our animation work, in our visualization, in our reports, and even in our presentation. And I think the emotive bit is kind of, it helps in either the funders or the programmatic team actually connect with info. It becomes kind of a point of like a motivator for action as opposed to, okay, it's just a status update or it's just a key piece of information. But it also helps drive conversation because often when somebody's talking about, okay, 50% of this happened, or we know that HIV prevalence is so much overall, yeah, and retention on antiretrovirals is really low. Then if you show the story of a person who say, okay, for example, here's Jerusha. Jerusha has been on antiretrovirals for so much time. These are some of the challenges. It becomes a lot more relatable and easier for people like in a boardroom or setting to start questioning, okay, what is the challenge with accessing the health facility or getting the meds in certain locations? So I think that I've seen how like storytelling has helped initiate like really good and strategic conversations on the table, which when you only have the numbers without the story, it's really hard to picture that and think about actually what can we do better. And I think there are also other cases. I mean, like COVID was an example of where it was affecting us like day to day. We were looking at those numbers, checking on Twitter where we at, and that's a clear case where it's kind of there was a direct connection to our own behavior because if you got kind of information or you got that WhatsApp, not WhatsApp, the SMS that said, oh, there's been a spike in cases in your vicinity, then we were like, okay, we're not going to go to the shops as much. We are like, yeah, are we doing the right things? So I think that was a case where there's kind of behavioral change that happens with storytelling at more of a program or a management level. And then there's also the storytelling that happens um, with the actual public, like everybody else, the you and I, that we are making a decision about our life right now. Um, yeah, I think those are some of the examples where like stories have translated to shifts in actual what we're doing.
Yeah, and I love that example about COVID because it shows how we use data to make decisions. And when you're using data to make decisions, you often find that there's a trend that the outcomes that you're getting are a lot more positive once you make decisions based off of the data.
Mhm.
So, and I love that you mentioned the quotes because I was looking at your social media and I saw that you've been putting out a few quotes here and there that are, uh, when you put out a quote and then you reference who gave the quotes, and then I saw
Yeah.
that you were referencing the data, and I thought that was really cool. So, one of the things that you mentioned was around gender-based violence, and I don't think people realize that there is data out there that we can use to inform our decisions, right? So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because when you put those quotes out there, it helps people use this data that you have access to or that we all have access to. It helps them understand that there is data out there that we can use to make decisions. And I think it touches on a bigger kind of vision there, right? It touches on this vision of a more data empowered society. I wonder if you could maybe share a little bit more about that vision and maybe how individuals could use data to make decisions more often in their daily lives.
Yeah, that's a tough one because I think definitely we can use more data. I do see that the data that is available is not all of it is in a format that's as accessible for us to use just yet. But there are platforms like Open Up, which is an awesome, it's a South African organization that a lot of their work is around ensuring that certain data is accessible, and they provide not just the data source itself, but like visualizations of it. Um, and so they have, for example, like statistics. Not, I think it's not only the like GBV statistics, but others, like even just locations of police stations. Which, if you access that, it can allow you to decide, okay, how do I access a certain service? Um, or maybe like you want to decide if you want to be, I don't know, living in that community, or what are some of the risks in that community. It provides some of that kind of information that you can interact with. But there's also information for people that I think there you can access data if you wanted to analyze yourself, which might be for like somebody that is either in university or school that wants to engage with data. You could use it there. But I do think that there's a lot of information that's fed to us, like through our newspapers, through our magazines, where we it's not always like explicit as a dashboard or a number, but it's written in the text, and that is where like it's important for us to look at those numbers but also interrogate it. Like if they're saying whatever, crime has gone up by 50% in my community, asking what does that mean, what type of crime, where did this data come from? And I think those are things that places you can engage with data, but also just starting like having that questioning behavior, because often our data needs you to not just take the first number you see, but say, what does that actually mean? If I broke it down a bit further, what is it telling me about what is useful in my location? What is useful about my behavior? Are there risks I need to think about? Are there risks for my family I need to be talking to my kids about? Because maybe, yeah, like literacy rates are really poor, and there was a recent study that was published on this. We do know for a long time our literacy rates in South Africa have been quite poor. But then that's information that you use and say, okay, what am I doing with to support my children? Can I are there places that I can access some support, or kind of information that I can better support my kids' literacy? So I think those are some of examples. There are things on our apps. I think we're like bombarded with information all the time. So a lot of data is always shared on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and even TikTok, where you can engage with it, but always like question, where is it coming from? What does it mean? I mean, I even those that use banking apps, I use the data that they provide on there, because they tell you like they have their little budget summary, and it pulls together your spend, and then you already have a picture of, oh my gosh, I'm spending so much on groceries, maybe I should adjust things, or I'm spending so much on entertainment, maybe I should adjust things. So I think, yeah, there's quite a few sources one can use in day-to-day life or thinking ahead, or if you want to actually interact with it. That more and more it's openly available.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I get so excited when I hear you talk about it because as you're speaking, I'm just thinking about all the opportunities that there are to innovate in the data space, right? When it comes to being able to make data more accessible, that and I love the fact that you mentioned the startup. What it was called, Open Up, right?
Open up. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's already people doing it. So that's also very inspiring because I think when we look at the challenges that we face in Africa and also specifically in South Africa, a lot of it centers around unemployment, right? And I think there are so many opportunities. And when you look at all this technology that's becoming available, I mean, if you look at ChatGPT, I saw that you also shared something on LinkedIn the other day where it was a tutorial on how you can analyze data without having any coding knowledge. You can visually represent it and extract information from it without having any coding knowledge nowadays because we have access to AI. So there's so many opportunities there that exist for young people to take advantage of. But I think in order to tie these opportunities in with solving the problem of unemployment, it really requires us to foster and encourage people to enter that journey of entrepreneurship, right? And that's something that you have experience in. You've built a business over the last 7, 8 years now, which is quite a long time. You're actually approaching almost 10 years. That's quite crazy if you think about it. Sure. And it's quite an achievement. So you've gone through a lot of experiences as a creative and as an entrepreneur. And I think that a lot of people in this community can are in that position. They're either creative or they're entrepreneur, or they're trying to find a way to merge these two things. What would you say has been kind of your biggest challenge when it comes to merging those two things together as an entrepreneur and creative? And sorry, and how did you navigate it? Because I think that's where the secret sauce comes in. It's like someone that might be experiencing a similar challenge. How did you navigate through it and manage to get to the point where you have the accolade of saying that you've been a business owner for 8 years?
Yeah. It's another big one. So, I mean, your first bit is really around like how did I combine the creative side and the entrepreneurship side?
Yeah, yeah, for
Okay.
sure. Like that's something that's very important, and a lot of people struggle to do that. So
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think it's also how we define like creativity first, because often when we think creativity, there's like different kinds of creativity, right? There's the artist creative, the dancer creative, there's a data scientist creative, and there's the problem solving creative. I'm sure there's a definition or something of it. So I think that it's almost like it's by default, entrepreneurship requires creativity because there's a lot of problem solving, and there's so many elements, and some of it is technical, some of it is like there are visual aspects to it. So I mean, even things like brand, you need kind of a creative thinking there. So I think it's been built in the process. Um, and I think also because I'm a creative, and I think actually creatives can thrive in entrepreneurship because you are kind of wired to see things differently, and kind of because in entrepreneurship you're always kind of looking at things at different angles, like how do I improve this? Because what you start out with is not necessarily where you're going to end up with, even in the same year of starting. But I mean, from kind of the visual side, I think what was important for me, like, is that we built it into almost it's part of our values. So we have like innovation as one of our values, and so we encourage that. So within the team, within our everyday work, it's like, how do we find spaces to think outside the box? Sometimes, because as things have grown, I've started moving a little bit more and more away from actually doing the creative, the fun stuff, which I do miss. So I think when you are actually doing like the the other creative things, like getting your hands dirty in that, sometimes as you grow, you don't get to be as close to it. You're more of the conceptual person. You're like, okay, I would like to see it in this way, or this is the type of direction and the creative structure you will always follow, but you don't do as much of the hands-on creativity, and then you kind of get the creative kick out of the other areas, solving what the brand will look like now, solving a problem about how are we going to get this client to actually move, like approve this document, like how do I engage with them differently. So I think that's where the creativity comes in. I mean, one of the biggest creative points, I mean, I also wanted to clarify that there was a major kind of turning point in the business at 5 years, because for the first 5 years it was Jerusha and quite a small team, so we were like a micro business, which was awesome. And there was a key point where like I saw a huge demand for our work, and I had limited capacity to do this, and saw kind of this could really go to the next level. And I think at that point what was like a creative move was looking at like how do I what is the alternative model of this. And we were already partnering with another team which is now like part of our team, and we explored what partnership would look like. And I think that was a creative step, because the next wasn't like, oh, get major investment or whatever, get bought out. It was like, actually, how do we partner for growth? And kind of shift gears in a different way. And that's when I collaborated with Ayanda and Mary Grace and the rest of the team in Khotso, who became kind of the founders of the iteration two. So as much as I've been part of this for the longest, for since 2015, the iteration two is 2 years old. So that was also kind of part of the like thinking creatively around how does the business look as a whole. Yeah.
No, that's cool. And I think something that you identified there, and I talk about this a lot on these podcasts, is the concept of collaboration over competition. Because in South Africa, I think just because of the past that we've experienced here with limits, with having resources limited, there's often very much a competition mindset where it's like, no, I need to crush my competition. I need to beat my competition. The pie is only limited. Whereas if you change your mindset slightly and you realize, you know what, like the results or the pie is not limited, we can grow a bigger pie. Africa is perfectly positioned for that. We have a very young population, and we have access to all this technology and ways to learn. So we're perfectly positioned to uplift ourselves in the global space and make that pie in Africa bigger. But an important part to making that happen is that concept of collaboration. Instead of viewing the guys that were also doing the same thing as you as competition, you kind of viewed them as collaboration, and then you were able to merge and then make an even bigger organization that wouldn't have been possible unless you had worked together. So I think that concept of collaboration is something that I'm really getting out of what you're saying. I don't know if there were any other specific challenges that come to mind that you experienced that you would probably say that you learned a very valuable lesson from that you could share with us.
Yeah, there were many challenges. I think one challenge which I probably still grapple with is kind of being an entrepreneur. Often entrepreneurs are very driven and can get kind of obsessed with their work. And I definitely have experienced that, and I've observed that in many other entrepreneurs. It's like managing your obsession, like finding that balance is important, because it can become something that, it's like it's your baby and you will stay up 24 hours to nurture it, but you're also a human. And I think that was one of the key challenges, kind of finding ways to balance that. And in fact, like I found part of that journey was me discovering mindfulness, and I often like go back to mindfulness practice, because it's the only way I can be like, okay, now you are going into obsess mode, and it's not healthy as an entrepreneur for you to stay there. Like you can be there for periods, but you need to also be a human being. So that's one challenge. I think we also experienced quite a few challenges around team and resourcing. I mean, like at that 5 year point was actually like a very critical point where I was like at capacity and trying to figure out like how do you do more with less. And I think one thing that the team that I then collaborated with, like they really brought like the sense of like actually bring in the resources, bring in the right people. And so experiencing kind of trying to do a lot with a little was a major challenge for me, but then learning from those around me and learning like how they've been able to identify great resources, which has allowed us to grow as well, like investing in people does help you grow. It's sometimes tough because obviously there's a financial kind of commitment to that, and there are
Mm,
risks with that.
mm,
But that was an important lesson, and I think there are many others as well. But I think those are like the key things. I guess relationships is also one. It
mhm,
kind of starting out, you do notice that, especially in our space, there are a couple of key players, and if you observe, you notice there are clicks, there are connections, and to get like certain projects or really get in, it was tough because you needed to be strategic. It's not just that somebody advertises the work and then you get the work. Like our business is not, and I think it's similar for other like creative spaces where it's really about relationships, about people getting to know you. And
mm,
so I did spend a lot of time, which I do, is talking to people, going to conferences, connecting, because that's how you really like get yourself into places where people are like, okay, cool, now we know you, we know what you can do, and let's do something together. Yeah.
Yeah, and relationships are built on trust. And I think that's the differentiating factor. You might have a better product and better service, but if the trust is missing, if people don't know you, who you are as a person, they can't trust you as an individual, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to work with them or for them to be able to take this budget that they have available and trust you with it. So that's something I've also learned is that trust element is so important, and that comes through connection. It comes through building relationship and getting to know people. And the other thing that you touched on, which I think is so essential, is being able to invest in people, because people are the ones that are going to drive it, and that's how you scale. If there's that saying, right? If you want to go somewhere fast, go alone. If you want to go somewhere far, take people with you. And that's that investment in people. And that's something that you've been working on a lot, especially through the DI Foundation, right? So I wanted to chat to you a little bit more about DI Foundation. What are kind of the goals behind that, and what kind of successes and change have you guys brought about into reality through the DI Foundation?
Yeah, I think this part, Josh, may not be as valuable because I think, in fact, the foundation, the idea is that we can channel, like, obviously some of our profits and also some of our, you know, some funders can invest in kind of our more like data usage initiatives. Um, that hasn't, like, our focus has largely been on the company for a period. So the idea is that we can grow the foundation, but we've not yet hit it. So we're still kind of at the point of building the business, and then we'll get the foundation going.
I don't know if I agree though, because I saw you guys recently ran a data artistry workshop. I don't know if that falls under the foundation or if that's something a bit different to the
It's
foundation.
still, yeah, so it's still part of the company. So data artistry is one of our initiatives, but it's because we do see ourselves as a social enterprise. We will often do initiatives that there's no fee to anyone because it's part of our contribution to building capacity, building skills. So data artistry is a company initiative. We do offer it as a service for different organizations, and then now and then we've got the webinars. So yeah, I think that's why I was like, the foundation is work in progress. We do have one project that has been implemented through the foundation, but it's something that we're still strategizing about. Like, actually, how do we make this? How do we make it grow? And also, like, how do we differentiate what is part of the company versus what is in the foundation? Because even the company has a social focus.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Could you tell us a little bit more about the recent workshop that happened and what kind of role it plays in terms of teaching people
sure.
data visualization and storytelling?
Yeah. Yes, something we're really driving is that I think, and well, let me first say this. In our way of working, our work is almost like structured around working ourselves out of a business because it's around like, how do we set things up so well and set up the ecosystem that at some point they will be like, I don't need Jerusha to do this because I can do it,
Hmm.
or I know somebody who can do that. So I mean, we there are certain things we will always do, but one of those areas is building the capacity in data skills. I firmly believe that there is major opportunity with data skills because I think as things grow, as we know, like generative AI, whatever, robotics and other things are going to advance, there's a certain kind of group of people who have advanced skills that had to go to university that are going to thrive in that space. But there's a huge opportunity for others that you don't have to have the degree. If you learn some kind of initial like introduction to Excel, or even like data cleaning, data presentation, these are things that can be introduced in many different roles. As a data capturer, as an administrator, as somebody that's working for the census and collating information. And so, because we see this great opportunity with data skills and developing it, and also not wanting our young people to be left behind, it is part of what we offer. And so, the online the webinar that was run recently was based on the content that we do it with teams and organizations, but we ran that specifically during kind of the youth month because we wanted to encourage young people to engage with these kinds of opportunities, build your data skills. There's this range of potential data skills, and when people say learn data, doesn't mean go be a data scientist. You can do that for sure, but there are various kind of opportunities throughout the data value chain where people are going to be needed more and more. Um, and I think there's a huge space for young people to enter there and have these skills, that it also gives you kind of that extra, that value add, as you are entering kind of a job or another space that you can then build on. It's really like an entry level building block that I think if young people all over have the skill, it can really like push you into career opportunities that you may not necessarily easily access. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's become so much more accessible through the tools that we have available to us, right? So like if you think about it previously, like you mentioned, you'd have to go to university and you'd have to learn all these skills in order to be able to do certain things. So whenever I think about it in terms of an analogy, it's like, let's say the objective or the value that was being provided to a business was digging a hole, right? Previously, you would have to go to university and you'd have to learn all these things and you'd have to do it manually. So think of that as like you using a spade to dig the hole. Now, with the tools that we have available to us, we have a whole freaking machine, like a digging machine. Like you don't need to be strong or like have really big muscles to be able to dig this massive hole, or you don't need 10 people to come and all with all big strong muscles to come and dig this hole. Strong muscles being your university degree, right? You can just hop into this digging machine and you can dig the same hole now with these tools that we have available. And that's what these AI tools are, is they're that digging machine that helps you achieve so much more, and anyone can hop in that seat and learn how to drive it a lot more easier than it would be to build all those muscles and get 10 other people to come and help you to dig the hole. So it's become a lot more accessible, and there's opportunities there. And that's why it's important that we have these conversations to make people aware of that. Something that we've been doing as well with data is, now that we're using these platforms like ChatGPT to do all these different tasks, we're constantly feeding data into these platforms. So, for example, if you're using ChatGPT to write all your emails, every time you create an email, you're going to have to give it instructions and context of your situation in order for it to create an email that's valuable to you. So, something that we've been working on is, through the Creatre community, I've connected with some developers and we've started creating a platform called Prompt Pulse. And basically what that does is, number one, it curates what you can use AI for. So I might be using AI to write my emails, whereas someone else is using it to create brand identity documents, or someone else is using it to write up, you might have a lawyer out there who's using it to write up contractual agreements, right? So we're all using AI in these different domains. So the first thing that it does is it allows people to take the prompts that they're using on these different platforms and put it onto the platform so that someone can hop on there and discover all these different things that AI can be used for. And also those prompts are curated by people that are specific to that domain, who have experience in that domain. So you're going to get the best possible output, right? The second thing that it does is, every time we put in data into these platforms, we want to record that data in order to keep the context of your situation. Because if you record that data, instead of having to re-enter it every time you're doing a specific task, you can use that data to do a whole array of different things without having to keep on plugging it in, because it's all recorded there and it is tied into your profile. So that's just one example of like an opportunity that has been created with these tools that are available, that we're working on and really keen to share at some point. But there's so many opportunities, and I just want to come back a little bit to one of the lessons that you also mentioned, like when it comes to in like going down the journey of following these opportunities and starting a business, you can get really like sucked in, and you can almost lose all the context of the other parts of your life because you're just focusing on this entrepreneurship journey. So something that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about was, and this is coming to Jerusha as a person, not as the founder of Data Innovators. I know that that you have a lot of interest when it comes to art, and when it comes to nature, and when it comes to traveling. I saw that you've also been doing quite a bit of traveling as well. I just wanted to find out where these interests came from, and what kind of value it kind of you get from embarking on these different journeys and these different elements of your life. Yeah, and
Yeah.
maybe you could even go into like how they kind of intersect with the work that you do and the data and creativity. Like how where do those things overlap?
Yeah. So I'm a very curious person. Like I said, like I want to understand. If I go to a place, I want to eat the food. I want to sit with people. I want to feel it completely. So I really enjoy that. I think it's part of my curiosity because it means I understand more. It's like a bit of an information gathering for me, which I know I will never be able to. Like no amount of reading and data is going to ever give me that moment. So I think that's why I really like, I do enjoy traveling. Obviously, a lot of my traveling has been with work, but even as a family, I mean, personally, we've got like a really old school um, Land Cruiser, that we like with the kids. We like to pack up and then we go on these road trips and just like discover. And it's something I encourage in my kids, my family, because yeah, that's who I am. I always want to know why, or what's this, or what's down that road. So I think that kind of curiosity does feed into my work. In that, I think it's part of being an innovator and a creative. It's always like discovering something new. Sometimes it even I find like real inspiration in things like I do try where possible to go experience art in different places, whether it's music, theatrical performance, or actually go see art pieces, because I find joy in, I don't know, noticing shapes that I didn't notice before, or colors or combinations. And even in that, I find stories which then, when we're doing some of our projects, I find an opportunity to incorporate it. I mean, for example, when we were in London, that was like just before COVID, we had a trip there. And I spent time in the art galleries, and I spent time at the theater, and I just spent time on the train. And one of my main inspirations for the project was, the underground map, like the different routes and so on. And we actually used that was for a project where we had to show like the connection, like created timeline. We used that as the inspiration for that infographic, where we were like, actually, we're going to use the London underground map as that, and kind of find ways. So I find that it ends up like I gather like these little bits of ideas. It's like building a big storyboard of stuff that I may never use. And then I find opportunities where I'm like, oh, I remember that moment, or the design on like the Moroccan kind of windows. I would like to use that. I see it here. I think that's how like my curiosity translates in some of the creative work, but it also just feeds that need to know more or learn more, or like find the things that people don't know. I love things like murder mysteries and futuristic things where like your mind is always going into different possibilities.
No, that's beautiful. That's so beautiful when you tie in that curiosity to art. I hope there's an artist listening to this, because I know with artists it can be difficult to continue putting out your work. You're kind of putting out a piece of yourself every time you do that, and you're putting it out into the world for the world to either to handle it in whatever way. Some people might love it, some people might hate it. You never know, and that can be very draining. And I think artists sometimes struggle with that. But what I'm getting from what you're saying is that there are curious people out there. And every time you put a piece of yourself out there, there's going to be someone who's curious who will come across it and will be able to extract something from it and then put it out and translate it into their own way. It's sort of like the butterfly effect, where this kind of message gets passed on from one person to another. And that's the beauty of humanity, is how we connect with one another through that. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to hear from you. That's amazing. I feel so inspired.
You put it so amazingly. I was like, oh, I thought these were just going on holidays and creative trips, but actually, the way you put it, yes, it is like if many of us are doing that, we actually are all sharing pieces of ourselves across
And,
the
and
globe.
it's actually an example of what I'm saying, because I wouldn't have been able to put it together unless you had shared your experience and how it's inspired the things that you're doing. So it's such a beautiful thing to think about. Jerusha, I see we're at 45, 54 minutes. In order to wrap this up and put it together and put a nice little bow on top, I want to ask you a little bit more about the future. What does the future look like for Jerusha, for data innovators? What kind of projects are you working on? What is your vision for Africa's digital economy?
Okay, you ending with such big questions. What is my vision for Africa's digital economy? Okay, I'll try to give you the politician's response. Okay, I'm joking. So, I mean, on the last one, and then I'll speak about like what's next. Actually, I think
Awesome.
my vision really is data and data communication and responsible data use is something that I think I will always be passionate about, and it's embedded in the work that we do. It's embedded in our focus on like really creating systemic change on the continent, and I think um, in my vision, I see that data innovators will grow and support this, like actually really show that we've contributed to a shift in digital transformation in how data is being used. And that we've actually also helped like build this cohort of young people that are data thinkers, that are creative thinkers. Um, and I think, yeah, there's a great opportunity there that in the coming years, we will see that there are more data driven initiatives that are made in Africa and that are by not just Africans, but like by young people. I feel that young people are going to be the tinkerers and the curious ones that are going to take information and really kind of question what's happening and how it's being used. So that's what I imagine, and that it's really driving that young people are using information and data to drive development the way they want. Like, how do you really want service delivery? How do you want government to respond to things? So that's how I imagine it, and I think we have that kind of contribution in like in nudging everyone forward and helping build kind of systems and help organizations set up the things that's going to enable that environment for everyone to thrive in. And yeah, and it goes like really with our slogan that we're all about pushing data boundaries. That so I think that's the work we are doing. It's like we're breaking down boundaries so that we'll be like, okay, guys, come through. Like we've done what we've done,
In the
fly
gates.
through. Yeah, we've opened it. But I think the last also like what happens in the future is that I really see like I'm telling everyone that this because I'm putting it out in the world. I want
Mm.
to do some crazy things with people, and I don't mean like nuts, like weird crazy. I mean like I want to do like big experiments. I want to look at like, and I think that's what we probably will be doing more of. It's like how are we working closer with artists? Something I've been really wanting to do is like how do we actually create a data art piece? Like how do we incorporate that is your next gallery experience? You're not just seeing an art piece, but you're seeing data in a visual way, and that we've even incorporated technology that we can use our app and you can scan the mountain and know I don't know the density of that mountain or what that mountain represents in a community. So I see ourselves doing a lot more of that, a lot more testing of like actually how are we introducing the possibilities and also helping set parameters and rules around drone technology, AI in development. So I think in the future, we'll definitely be at the forefront in thought leadership of these things, but probably also have a few crazy projects under our belt where we're like, we tried this out, maybe it didn't work, or we've created this beautiful art piece and it incorporates data and tech and it's awesome. We'll see.
Yeah, no, for sure. That sounds super exciting. I hope that there's a creative listening to this that can obviously reach out to you and maybe collaborate. I think that would be amazing. And yeah, thank you so much, Jusha. My heart feels full after this conversation. I feel so inspired and I feel so positive about the future of South Africa. And I think we really need to share these stories more often. People don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And that's why we have this podcast. We have this podcast to share these stories about the amazing stuff that you guys have been working on, your dedication, the impact that you're having on people, on individuals who want to learn and grow and progress their careers, opening that door so that people can walk through. people don't often get to hear about these. So I hope that we can reach someone, and someone who's curious, and hopefully this can inspire something within them to kind of pass that on to the next person. So thank you so much for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it. Once again, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. My hope is that we have illuminated what is possible for you. My hope is that we've inspired you to start your journey of elevating Africa in the global space. It is possible. At the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned the African wave. This is it. We are creating a platform for the elevation of Africa in the global space. If you want to join this wave, but you're not too sure where to start, I'd like to encourage you to find out more about the Creatre community. Our community is founded on 3 pillars: coaching, connecting, and culture. Through these pillars, we hope to create a point of convergence for future leaders of Africa. If you are a leader and you want to be a part of this movement, please visit our website. You'll find courses of finding your online voice and see when our next networking event is coming up. We're excited for you to join our journey in connecting Africa to the digital economy. But until then, we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for watching, and bye.